The Trump administration has embarked on an intensified campaign of economic and diplomatic pressure against Iran, combining sweeping financial sanctions with unprecedented military threats in response to Tehran's violent suppression of nationwide protests. This multifaceted approach represents a significant escalation in Washington's posture toward the Islamic Republic, intertwining economic warfare with humanitarian concerns and national security imperatives. The administration's actions, announced in late January, signal a coordinated effort to simultaneously deprive the Iranian regime of petroleum revenues while deterring further violence against civilians demanding political and economic reform. On January 23rd, the United States Treasury Department unveiled comprehensive sanctions targeting 9 vessels belonging to what officials describe as Iran's shadow fleet, a clandestine maritime network designed specifically to circumvent international sanctions. These vessels, along with 8 associated management firms and operators based across multiple jurisdictions including India, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, have collectively facilitated the transport of petroleum products valued at hundreds of millions of dollars to international markets, primarily in Asia. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent characterized the action as striking at a fundamental pillar of the Iranian regime's financial infrastructure. The sanctions represent a deliberate effort to disrupt the economic mechanisms that enable Tehran to fund what Washington describes as destabilizing regional activities, weapons development programs, and internal security apparatus used to suppress dissent. The vessels targeted in this latest tranche include the Palau-flagged Sea Bird, Al-Diab II, and Caesarea, as well as the Comoros-flagged Avon and Chiron V. These ships exemplify the characteristics typical of shadow fleet operations: aging hulls, deliberately obscured ownership structures, and operation under flags of convenience that complicate enforcement and accountability. The vessels frequently sail without the comprehensive insurance coverage required by major international ports and legitimate petroleum companies, operating instead in a gray zone of maritime commerce designed to evade detection and enforcement. The shadow fleet phenomenon represents a sophisticated response to multilateral sanctions regimes. These vessels typically operate through shell companies established in jurisdictions with limited regulatory oversight, frequently changing names, ownership documentation, and flag registrations to avoid identification. Ship-to-ship transfers in international waters allow Iranian petroleum to be laundered into global markets, with cargoes often changing hands multiple times before reaching their final destinations, primarily refineries in China and other Asian markets. According to shipping analytics firms tracking Iranian petroleum exports, despite intensifying sanctions, Tehran has maintained export volumes of approximately 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels per day throughout the current period, representing a substantial increase from previous years. This persistence demonstrates both the scale of the shadow fleet operation and the challenges facing enforcement efforts. Over 60% of vessels that have loaded Iranian crude in the past year are now under some form of sanctions designation, yet the trade continues largely unabated. The Treasury Department emphasized that revenues generated through these illicit petroleum sales directly fund Iran's regional proxy networks, ballistic missile programs, and nuclear development activities, rather than benefiting the Iranian population through investment in public services and economic infrastructure. These resources are diverted to what American officials characterize as destabilizing military and paramilitary operations throughout the Middle East. The entities sanctioned alongside the vessels illustrate the international scope of Iran's sanctions evasion networks. Management firms operating from the United Arab Emirates provide operational oversight and technical management for shadow fleet vessels, while companies registered in India, Oman, and offshore jurisdictions like the Marshall Islands and Liberia provide ownership structures designed to obscure Iranian state involvement. This geographic dispersion complicates enforcement efforts, as it requires coordination among multiple national authorities with varying degrees of commitment to sanctions enforcement. The United States has increasingly leveraged secondary sanctions, penalties imposed on non-American entities that engage in prohibited transactions, to extend its enforcement reach beyond American jurisdiction. However, this approach has generated friction with commercial partners and raised questions about the extraterritorial application of American law. The current sanctions build upon multiple previous rounds of designations targeting Iranian petroleum exports. The Trump administration has issued several waves of such sanctions since returning to office, implementing what officials describe as a maximum pressure campaign designed to reduce Iranian petroleum exports to zero. Previous actions in December and April targeted dozens of additional vessels and their associated networks, including executives of the National Iranian Oil Company and international petroleum brokers facilitating Iranian sales. Treasury officials have framed the sanctions as ultimately serving the interests of the Iranian people, arguing that petroleum revenues rightfully belonging to the population are instead diverted to fund repression, proxy warfare, and weapons programs. This narrative positions economic pressure as aligned with the aspirations of Iranian citizens demanding better governance and economic management. However, critics of the sanctions approach argue that broad economic pressure inevitably impacts civilian populations, potentially exacerbating the very economic grievances that have sparked protests. The collapse of Iran's currency. The rial now trades at approximately 1.4 million to the dollar, reflects in part the cumulative impact of sanctions on the country's economic fundamentals. While the Iranian government's mismanagement and corruption certainly contribute to economic dysfunction, sanctions defenders and critics continue to debate the proportionate impact of external pressure versus internal policy failures. The Iranian government has consistently characterized sanctions as economic warfare targeting civilians, arguing that restrictions on petroleum sales and financial transactions impede the country's ability to import essential goods, including medical supplies and humanitarian items. American officials counter that humanitarian exemptions exist within the sanctions framework and that the regime's choices regarding resource allocation, not sanctions themselves, are responsible for civilian hardship. Beyond economic sanctions, the Trump administration has adopted an increasingly confrontational rhetorical stance toward Iran in response to the regime's handling of widespread protests that erupted in late December. These demonstrations, initially triggered by economic grievances following the currency collapse, have evolved into broader calls for political change and, in some instances, regime replacement. President Trump has issued repeated warnings that the United States would intervene militarily should Iranian security forces continue using lethal force against demonstrators. In statements aboard Air Force One and through social media platforms, Trump declared that America possesses an armada moving toward the Persian Gulf region, though he expressed preference for avoiding military conflict if possible. The president characterized the deployment as both a deterrent and a signal of American readiness to act if Iranian authorities persist in violent suppression of protests. The current wave of demonstrations represents the most significant challenge to the Islamic Republic's authority since major protests in 2022 following the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. Human rights monitoring organizations have documented protests in at least 78 cities across 185 locations, with demonstrators explicitly demanding the end of clerical rule under Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The scale of casualties remains disputed, with figures varying dramatically depending on the source. Human rights organizations based outside Iran have documented hundreds of deaths among protesters, with some estimates exceeding 500 civilians killed. Iranian state media, meanwhile, has reported significantly higher total casualties, including security personnel, attributing many deaths to what authorities characterize as armed agitators and foreign-directed operatives rather than peaceful demonstrators. Videos that have circumvented Iran's internet shutdown, likely transmitted via satellite communication systems, appear to show security forces using live ammunition against crowds of protesters. Footage from hospitals and morgues depicts civilians with gunshot wounds consistent with military-grade weaponry, contradicting official narratives that characterize the demonstrations as violent riots requiring forceful response. The Iranian government has implemented a comprehensive internet blackout designed to prevent coordination among protesters and limit international awareness of the crackdown. This information control strategy, combined with mass arrests exceeding 1,000 individuals according to human rights groups, reflects the regime's assessment that the protests pose a fundamental threat to its legitimacy and survival. Trump's warnings to Iran have evolved through several iterations, beginning with relatively restrained expressions of solidarity with protesters and escalating to explicit threats of military intervention. The president initially stated in mid-January that the United States had been informed that killings in Iran were ceasing, suggesting that American pressure had influenced Iranian behavior. However, as protests continued and reports of casualties mounted, Trump renewed his threats with increasing specificity. On January 22nd, Trump claimed that his earlier warnings had prevented the execution of 840 individuals arrested during the protests, stating that he had directly communicated to Iranian authorities that mass hangings would trigger devastating American retaliation. The president characterized potential American action as exceeding the scope and intensity of previous military operations, referencing the June strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities as a comparative baseline. These references point to a significant military engagement in mid-2025 when American forces participated in a 12-day Israeli-led campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That operation, which included strikes on multiple Iranian nuclear sites, prompted retaliatory Iranian missile attacks on American facilities in Qatar. The prospect of renewed military confrontation raises concerns about potential escalation dynamics, particularly given Iran's demonstrated willingness and capability to strike American forces and assets throughout the region. American officials, speaking anonymously to provide operational details, confirmed that the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and several guided missile destroyers are en route to the Middle East. This naval deployment adds to the approximately 30,000 American military personnel already stationed in the region, including forces in Iraq, Syria, and various Gulf states. The presence of a carrier strike group provides substantial military capabilities, including naval aviation assets, missile defense systems, and amphibious assault capabilities. However, military analysts note that deployment of naval forces does not necessarily presage imminent combat operations. Such deployments can serve multiple purposes: deterring adversary action, reassuring regional partners, providing evacuation capabilities for American citizens if necessary, and maintaining flexible response options for policymakers. The absence of large-scale troop mobilizations or massive airlift operations suggests that the administration has not committed to major ground operations in Iran. Instead, military planners are likely developing contingency plans ranging from limited precision strikes targeting specific elements of Iran's security apparatus to more extensive air campaigns against military infrastructure. Cyber operations and clandestine support for opposition elements represent additional options that would allow American involvement while limiting direct military exposure. Iranian officials have responded to American threats with their own warnings, emphasizing that American military installations throughout the region would constitute legitimate targets in any conflict. Senior Iranian military commanders and political figures have issued statements asserting that Iran would respond to any American attack with overwhelming force, setting the region on fire and eliminating safe havens for American forces. These exchanges reflect a dangerous escalation in rhetoric that raises concerns about miscalculation and inadvertent conflict. The presence of substantial American and allied forces in close proximity to Iranian territory, combined with the heightened tensions surrounding the protest movement, creates conditions where incidents or misunderstandings could trigger broader confrontation. Regional states with American military presence, including Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Bahrain, find themselves in potentially precarious positions. These countries host American forces and rely on American security guarantees, yet they also maintain complex economic and diplomatic relationships with Iran. An escalation of American-Iranian military conflict would force difficult choices for these states and could expose their populations and infrastructure to Iranian retaliation. Despite the inflammatory rhetoric, diplomatic communications between Washington and Tehran have continued through intermediaries. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has engaged in discussions with American Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, suggesting that both sides maintain channels for de-escalation even as they posture aggressively in public statements. Iranian officials have indicated openness to negotiation while simultaneously asserting readiness for military confrontation. This dual messaging likely reflects internal debates within the Iranian power structure between those who see potential benefit in diplomatic engagement and hardliners who view any compromise as weakness. The Iranian government faces the challenge of managing domestic unrest while navigating external pressure, with limited room for maneuver given economic constraints and recent military setbacks. While economic grievances sparked the current protest movement, demonstrator demands have expanded to encompass fundamental political change. Chants of death to the dictator reference Supreme Leader Khamenei directly, while some protesters have invoked the memory of the pre-revolutionary Iranian monarchy, with Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, living in exile in the United States, receiving mention in some demonstrations. This evolution from economic protest to political challenge mirrors patterns observed in previous Iranian protest movements. The regime's inability to address fundamental economic dysfunction, combined with endemic corruption and political repression, has created deep wells of popular frustration that periodically erupt into overt challenges to the system's legitimacy. The Iranian government has attempted various responses, with President Masoud Pezeshkian, a relative moderate within the system, calling for dialogue with protesters and acknowledgement of legitimate grievances. However, Pezeshkian's authority is circumscribed by the clerical power structure, particularly the Revolutionary Guard Corps and security services that answer directly to the supreme leader. This division between civilian government and security apparatus limits the regime's ability to implement meaningful reforms or de-escalate through concession. Human rights organizations have documented extensive abuses by Iranian security forces during the protests, including arbitrary detention, torture of prisoners, denial of due process, and threats of mass executions. Iran's Attorney General has publicly warned that protest participants could face charges as enemies of God, a designation that carries capital punishment under Iranian law. The regime's history of mass executions following political unrest creates legitimate concerns that current detainees face mortal danger. Iran executed over 2,000 individuals in 2024 according to human rights monitors, the highest rate in over a decade. Many of these executions involved individuals convicted in proceedings that failed to meet international standards for fair trial, with charges often relating to political activities characterized as threatening national security. American officials have cited these concerns as justification for their threats of intervention, framing potential military action as humanitarian protection for civilians facing state violence. However, critics note the complexity of such intervention, pointing to previous American military actions in the Middle East that, while ostensibly undertaken for humanitarian purposes, produced significant civilian casualties and long-term instability. The Trump administration's approach represents a test of whether maximum economic and military pressure can compel fundamental change in Iranian behavior or even regime change. Proponents argue that economic sanctions degrade Iran's capacity to fund destabilizing activities, while political pressure empowers domestic opposition movements. The combination of economic deprivation and international isolation, in this view, creates conditions where the regime either moderates its behavior or faces collapse. Skeptics counter that decades of sanctions and pressure have failed to produce the desired outcomes, instead strengthening hardline elements within the Iranian power structure who benefit from external threats to justify repression and centralized control. The regime has demonstrated remarkable resilience, adapting to sanctions through development of illicit networks, cultivation of alternative trading partners, and mobilization of nationalist sentiment against foreign pressure. The current situation presents a particularly acute version of this debate. Iran faces simultaneous economic crisis, domestic unrest, diplomatic isolation, and military threat. Yet the regime has shown no inclination toward capitulation. Instead, Iranian authorities have doubled down on repression while maintaining defensive military postures and exploring limited diplomatic openings that might reduce pressure without requiring fundamental concessions. The deployment of American naval forces to the Persian Gulf, combined with explicit presidential threats of intervention, creates dangerous possibilities for escalation through miscalculation or incident. The proximity of American and Iranian forces, combined with the presence of Iranian proxy militias throughout the region, generates multiple potential flashpoints where localized confrontations could expand into broader conflict. Iranian missile and drone capabilities, demonstrated during retaliatory strikes following previous American and Israeli attacks, pose genuine threats to American forces and regional allies. While the United States possesses overwhelming conventional military superiority, Iran's asymmetric warfare capabilities, including cyber operations, naval mine warfare, proxy militia operations, and ballistic missile forces, could impose significant costs in any conflict. The economic and strategic consequences of major American-Iranian military confrontation extend well beyond the immediate combatants. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 1/5 of global petroleum exports transit, would become a primary battleground in any conflict. Disruption to energy flows through this choke point would send shockwaves through global energy markets, with cascading effects on economic growth and inflation worldwide. The trajectory of Iran's protest movement remains highly uncertain. Previous waves of unrest have ultimately been suppressed through combination of violent repression, targeted arrests of leadership, information control, and limited concessions that divide opposition movements. However, each successive protest wave has demonstrated greater boldness and more fundamental demands, suggesting cumulative erosion of the regime's legitimacy, particularly among younger Iranians who do not remember the revolutionary period. The international community's response will significantly influence outcomes. Sustained attention and support for human rights documentation can raise costs for repression, while coordinated diplomatic pressure may create space for opposition movements. However, external intervention also provides the regime with narratives to delegitimize protests as foreign-directed operations rather than authentic expressions of popular grievance. American military threats present particular complications for protesters. While some activists welcome international pressure on the regime, others express concern that association with American intervention discredits their movement domestically and provides authorities with justification for characterizing demonstrators as foreign agents. This tension between welcoming external support and maintaining the indigenous character of opposition movements represents an ongoing challenge. Despite multiple rounds of sanctions targeting Iranian petroleum exports, the Shadow Fleet has demonstrated remarkable adaptability. As vessels are designated and blocked from legitimate ports, new companies emerge to replace sanctioned entities, ships change flags and ownership documentation, and alternative transportation routes develop. The fundamental driver, Chinese demand for discounted Iranian crude, remains robust, providing economic incentives for intermediaries willing to navigate sanctions risks. Effective suppression of the Shadow Fleet would require not only American enforcement but active cooperation from flag states, port authorities, insurance providers, and most critically, purchasers of Iranian petroleum. China's willingness to continue importing Iranian oil despite American pressure reflects both economic interest in discounted supplies and geopolitical calculations regarding American influence over its economic relationships. The Treasury Department has sought to address this challenge through expanded use of secondary sanctions, threatening penalties on entities facilitating Iranian petroleum trade regardless of their nationality. However, this approach generates friction with commercial partners and raises questions about the sustainability of American financial leverage as targeted countries explore alternatives to dollar-denominated transactions and American financial infrastructure. The convergence of American economic sanctions, military threats, and Iranian domestic unrest creates a situation of extraordinary complexity and danger. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign seeks to simultaneously degrade Iranian capabilities, deter violent repression of protests, and potentially catalyze regime change or fundamental behavioral modification. The coming weeks and months will test whether economic deprivation, diplomatic isolation, and military threat can produce desired outcomes without triggering regional conflagration. Iranian authorities face excruciating choices between violent suppression of dissent with attendant international consequences or accommodation that might encourage further challenges to their authority. For the Iranian people, the crisis represents both opportunity and peril. The protest movement has demonstrated remarkable courage and persistence in demanding change, yet faces a security apparatus willing to employ lethal force to maintain control. International support provides some protection and amplification for their voices, yet also exposes them to accusations of foreign collaboration that the regime exploits to justify repression. The shadow fleet sanctions, meanwhile, represent one component of a broader economic warfare strategy whose ultimate effectiveness remains contested. While individual vessel designations and network disruptions impose costs and complications on Iranian petroleum exports, the fundamental challenge of enforcing unilateral sanctions against a determined adversary with willing commercial partners persists. As American naval forces steam toward the Persian Gulf and Iranian security services patrol streets from Tehran to provincial cities, the region confronts perhaps its most dangerous moment in recent years. Whether this crisis resolves through diplomatic de-escalation, successful suppression of protests, regime accommodation of popular demands, or military confrontation remains unclear. What appears certain is that the current trajectory is unsustainable, and that decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and throughout the region in the coming period will have profound consequences for Middle Eastern stability and global security architecture. The intersection of economic coercion, military posturing, and popular uprising creates conditions of fundamental uncertainty. Historical precedents offer limited guidance, as each crisis emerges from unique combinations of domestic politics, international pressure, and strategic calculation. The Iranian regime has survived previous challenges through resilience and ruthlessness, yet each successive crisis further erodes its legitimacy and depletes its resources. Whether the current moment represents another crisis to be weathered or a tipping point toward fundamental transformation remains among the most consequential questions facing the Middle East and global order.